This is Reality Dispatch, written by Jim Mintz.
Seismologists thought that it might have been there for close to a couple of thousand years, buried deep underground, undetected. The general public didn't think so, no matter what science fed them on the official platforms. It was too coincidental that a 9-meter groundswell would move around a perfect sphere at close to 40 kilometers an hour, wiping out anything in its path until the wave passed and it was safe for those venturing to the building, coincidentally located right in the eye of the beast, the Congress. The swirl began 10,000 years ago, approximately in a very tiny formation that grew underground and quickly ascended over the centuries. When the engineers were building the Congress building, they didn't realize the seismic activity would gravitate as much as it has. Now that the Congress building is over a century old, the ground wave is higher now than it ever has been and is highly hazardous and dangerous, said one such scientist on morning radio. It was the stuff of legend, this circular ground wave that would kill anyone in its path. But for the law-passing structure in its center, people needed to actually go near it if anything needed to be accomplished in regard to the law of the land. Why is that the case, you ask? The Constitution. Always the Constitution. It reads as follows. The Congress on the geological map at the coordinates listed 113264 longitude will be the sole place of the passing of any laws that are to proceed over the lands of this country, and this place alone will be the sole passer of laws therein. No amount of designated legislation can surpass this decree. No laws shall be passed upon any other place of authority. This shall be automatically defunct. Constitutional scholars debated the merits of this passage for decades, yet no concerted efforts were made to house the structure of lawmaking in any other location. Even when the Prime Minister of the day was killed in a crossing accident as the seismic wave experienced an acceleration in its rotation right after World War II. If that wasn't enough of a straw to break the camel's back, it was a rainy Wednesday afternoon in the nation's capital, and the public servants had broken for the Christmas break. Congress still had a week of sitting left to pass the laws promised in the term of the newly elected government. Most passed without objection. One was left on the list that drew national coverage and was met with vocal hostility: the Invasive Surveillance Act. This piece of legislation was brought about due to an attempted coup on the government of the day. Notwithstanding the fact that the deliberations of this act occurred 17 years prior to this day, the fear in the minds of those elected officials was enough to keep this bill alive over the years. A month prior to the Christmas break, they rallied outside the diameter of the wave and waited their turns as the breaks in the swirls allowed for a brief passage. Drivers would hit the accelerator through the desert landscape that surrounded the lonely building, carrying 3 to 4 politicians at a time before making the return trip for another escort. The trip would take the better part of 3 days, escorting over 300 congressmen and women. Once the job was complete, the lockdown was in place, and those inside the building weren't going anywhere until the legislative agenda was fulfilled. It was only then that the outside world received a glimpse of the agenda items, including the Invasive Surveillance Act. The controversial bill will require all citizens to install home monitoring technology at their own expense in every room of their dwelling to allow the newly formed Department of Peacekeeping the unfettered ability to watch any and all citizens at a 24-hour period, non-stop. Any gaps in the system will be filled with AI bots who will be assigned to specific citizens for the duration of the person's life. The bill is expected to pass unanimously on Friday. The news report read. A crowd gathered on the outskirts of the wave. It had passed them 30 minutes prior and was scheduled to make another pass in an hour and a half. However, the crowd was noticing the speed with which the 18-meter tall wave was engaging was increasing. A protester had their stopwatch out and stood a half a kilometer back on the fringe of the nearby suburb of Cuthbert. I think it's speeding up. It's not meant to pass us until 90 minutes. But I can see the wall of dirt on the horizon, and I think it will make another pass in about 15 minutes, he said to another. How can that be? The other replied. Isn't it dictated by the tides? He wondered. No, it's the gravitational pull of the moon, another wondered. There were close to 50 of them in proximity of the suburb's edge, but there were thousands closer to the fringes where the wave actually would sweep past. The bill is expected to pass in 1 hour, said one who had a live stream of the 24-hour news channels blaring out of his phone. We have to get in there now and stop them, he suggested. They joined the masses, who were led by a singular voice yelling into a megaphone. I'm prepared to run through the beast, through the swirl, and stop these bastards from invading our lives, he yelled. The crowd roared in approval. I'd rather die in the wave than let them infiltrate our lives, upend our privacy, and make us live as their obedient servants. Once more, the crowd roared in approval. I have never wanted to die for anything more important than this. Fuck the wave and fuck them, he screamed. The crowd was sold on his every line. The monitoring of the wave had dwindled away. The time to act had arrived. There were thousands of them, and there were 300 inside the building. The vote was due to take place in 20 minutes, and it was at least a 30-minute walk to the front doors. If they ran, they could make it in 15. Some of them would die. The leader could not stop himself. He was too worked up. The crowd was behind him. All thoughts of death had dissipated and were replaced with desire, the desire to remove the ones who would bring about the invasive legislations. They work for us. Let's show them who's boss, came a voice from the crowd. They were marching, and then they were running. The wave rose from the rear and was gaining on them. It used to be 12 feet high, and now it was closer to 25 meters, an enormous groundswell, a wall of dirt traveling faster than they were running. Fuck the wave, keep running, they yelled and cheered as they pounded the dirt harder and faster with every step. Some amongst them were fit and were gaining on the doors, pushing closer to removal from harm's way. Most were not and were on the brink of being swept away by the unnatural disaster. We won't forget you, the leader yelled from the front doors of the Congress, watching as the masses that had followed him to the door were carted off to an unfortunate and violent end. Further fueling his anger, he turned to the glass doors and began pounding away with the remaining survivors that had joined him in their bid to overturn the vote that had just taken place in the chamber.
For more stories of fact-based fiction, head to jimmins.substack.com.